All right, let me bring Michael in here. When you were obviously at the White House, you had many of the same challenges that Grant is talking about today. When we talk about shared services, yeah, okay, maybe I'll do CDM, but no, don't take this away from me and don't take that away from me. And Grant doesn't really understand my problem. I'm unique. You have that uniqueness. And even though that I can't hire the best people, I'm doing okay. And you can say, well, here's your data that says you're not, but I'm doing okay. How do you fight that inertia? Because we've seen that with data center modernization. We see that with financial management, HR, shared services. I mean, there's very few examples of shared services working well.
So I think that there are a couple of combinations there. One of which is that there does have to be a trade, right? And the trade has to be that we're going to take a problem away from you, and we're going to let you go solve something else that is actually more important to you. So we're going to enable you to free up some resources to go spend on improving the technology that your workforce actually uses, so that perhaps we could move some of our federal agencies into the early 2000s in terms of the collaboration tools that's available to them, right? So it really has to be connected not just to the IT operations. I would go even further than what Grant was saying, but actually connect it directly to the business operations. And a good example of this right now in the private sector is what's happening in the trade-off between, in the financial services sector, in the trade-off between transactions and cybersecurity and fraud detection. Much of the rest of the world's already moved well past this, but in the United States, we're finally starting to move away from wire transfers in the financial services sector. In cybersecurity terms, if you're looking at a wire transfer, you have forever. You have like 24 hours, which is effectively infinity to look at the transaction from a cybersecurity standpoint. But the financial services industry is moving much more towards instantaneous transactions. Now you've got a business problem trade-off. Because if I actually take the time to look at it from a fraud detection and cybersecurity standpoint, I slow down the transaction and my customers get mad. But if I let a whole bunch of fraud happen and people get ripped off, my customers get mad. So how do I actually square that up? Well, you've got to have the conversation between the business side and the operation and the cybersecurity side to actually manage that risk and accept risk on both sides. And so what I would say is where we got to move the conversation in the federal agencies is to have that conversation between the agencies, their business side, their cybersecurity side, and the cybersecurity providers at DHS about how we're going to manage that risk holistically, both the cybersecurity risk and the mission risk across the federal enterprise. And if we start putting it in those terms, then it'll be much more exciting for the agencies.
All right, I want to move on to a different topic, but I have one quick question for you, Grant. So when it comes to shared services, what seems to work best is this idea of I'm going to consolidate internally and then look externally. Is that the crawl, walk, run issue we're looking at, or challenge, where, hey, maybe an agency, and we've seen this with commerce, you've seen this, I think, with HHS, where they said, okay, we have all these security operations centers, now we're going to have one. I think energy is another one that's done that too.
Yeah, so I think we need to look at a couple approaches, and crawl, walk, run is I think something we historically do a lot of in the government. I think we also historically get sidetracked before we get to run, right? Somewhere along the line, there's a new thing to start crawling on and walking on, and we fail to really finish it. And so I think we do need to have agencies looking internally, and at the same time, we need to look across government because we get different windows of opportunity. Right now, we certainly have a window of opportunity to look at consolidation and centralization, and I think we need to take advantage of it. And we have an opportunity sort of cross government. At the same time, agencies should be doing, which is more pressure. To Michael's point, what are we going to take off the plate? We're very good at taking nothing off the plate and only adding stuff from where I sit, which, having been on the other end, I know is not as the perfect for success. However, we've got to find a way to work, I think, down both those streams to some degree.
All right, that was the proper answer, I guess. Both. Michael, you said something, we'll talk about information sharing, and one of the things Michael said was, are we sharing maybe the wrong information or too much information? Are we asking people to share information that they aren't really capable of sharing? So maybe it has to happen in the back end. ISPs, companies like Symantec could share, but then the business side. So describe what that means if I'm in the mission area, what am I sharing? I'm not sharing my business. Hey, I had this problem and this is how I solved it, but what am I sharing around cybersecurity that could let Grant, who has maybe a different mission area, really beg, borrow, and steal and understand better?
So a lot of it is really focused, in my view, on sort of the risks that are in a given area, and then what are you doing in terms of best practices to actually change your behavior so that you are more secure? How are you thinking about the problem, and what are the solutions that you've been pursuing to it? Those are the kinds of how is this problem manifesting in terms of its impact on your business. Other bits that are useful to share. How did you actually convince the CEO to invest more in theirs? What arguments actually were persuasive to the board or to the secretary or the deputy secretary, right? What arguments were persuasive with OMB in the budget process, for example. That's the kind of information that I think is much more useful, and it's much more contextual, and it's much richer. It's not a long string of SHA-256 hashes, which is useful to a certain group of people, but is not broadly useful across a lot of business units.
So, Grant, I wrote a story recently, and I had interviews with both DHS and DoD. They said very similar things. They talked about return on investment when it comes to cybersecurity, and one of the things they both said was, and separately, but very similar, is that, for instance, at DHS, the OCIO office, they have what they call a maturity model for cybersecurity, how to explain the return on investment, which is, I think, gets to Michael's point. At DoD, they have a security scorecard, and initially it was all about just cyber hygiene basics, but now they're looking at more advanced kind of scorecard. How do you take that from your perspective, NSC, OMB hats, your two hats that you wear, and push that to agencies, non-cyber people too, to kind of help them understand that ROI piece? So again, Michael said that the investment is understandable.
Yeah, and I think this is a significant challenge that we have for a couple reasons. We are often trying to explain it to leadership who maybe doesn't understand, and they don't need to understand the technology, but we certainly need leadership to ask more sophisticated questions than, am I secure yet? Am I safe yet? Right, which, no. is certainly, because that is always the answer. And added to that is a lot of technologists aren't good at talking to senior leadership, period, let alone, and I think as technologists we often want to bring, if everyone just understood how hard my job is as the CIO or the CISO, they would just feel more sorry for me and they'll give me more money and make those investments. I think and what we've really tried to push on, though, for the last couple of years is the NIST cybersecurity framework. As a lens, it's being updated. Actually, I think it'll go out for public comment sometime for the second round of public comment, the update to it later this month, if not this week or next week. But the framework for identify, detect, protect, respond, and recover is a lens that technologists can understand and senior leadership can understand. We actually have shifted so that the IGs across the federal government are doing a maturity model assessment of agencies for their audits against the NIST framework, because I may be really good at responding because I have so darn many incidents, and I don't know that I want to get really good scores there because I'm just good at responding because I have so many problems. And so it really provides a lens where you can start to understand your investments. So we have also, from an OMB standpoint, we are having agencies decompose their cybersecurity investments across the different elements of the framework so we can understand and then try to get a correlation. The bottom line, of course, is that there is no place called safe, even if I'm all 5s or all 10s or all green or whatever your dashboard looks like. That doesn't prevent things from happening. However, it certainly means that the due diligence and the due care is being taken at a particular agency and puts us in a much better place.
So I want to go workforce in the last couple of minutes, but again, one last question for Michael, kind of building off what Grant said. Why do I still need to convince my DepSec, my secretary, my assistant secretary of management that they should invest in cybersecurity? Isn't OPM enough? Isn't JP Morgan Chase enough? Isn't Target enough? There's, as Mike Fay talked about, we can't be apathetic to the breaches anymore. It can't be like, oh, it's another one. But you don't want to be on the front page of the federalnewsradio.com. Shameless plug one. Go.
I think there's, Grant was actually talking about this, and part of what I've seen is that there's sort of two reactions. Actually, there is one reaction that is fatalistic. It's not apathy, but it's fatalism. Everybody's going to get hacked, and there's nothing I can do about it. So we've been pumping money into this problem for years. We've never gotten any better. We still suck. So it's why bother? And then the other side is well, you can't possibly understand it unless you're a techno geek, because every time my CISO comes and talks to me, he keeps talking about the number of appliances into the stack and whether or not the snort flabulator is configured properly, and I don't understand any of it. And so I think that what we actually have to do is how do you actually tie the investments to some specific goals that are actually measurable and accountable, but are actually effective at improving your cybersecurity. And I think that's where we actually need to go, and that's the kind of conversations we need to be having at the senior level. I will say that the conversations did get much easier for many federal agencies after OPM, right? Because more secretaries and deputy secretaries could see themselves in the director of OPM than in the leaders of the national security agencies.
All right, so we have about a minute and a half left. I'm going to ask them both about the workforce issue, because that was, again, a theme that ran through both of your talks. And let me start with Grant. The workforce issue is twofold, you mentioned. You mentioned it's the people, meaning who to do the work, but then it's the broader people of the federal employee, the contractor, and the insider threat, I'll call it, or the oops, I made a mistake person. What is happening beyond, we know there's a cyber EO, we know you're working on important stuff, but what are we doing, what are you doing around the workforce to really improve that piece of it? And Mike, I'll have a similar one for you. So
I guess two things. One, we continue to work the education of senior leadership, because it being, in my mind, cybersecurity largely, or a big piece of it, is a people problem, it's also a management problem. A lot of the gains we saw after the OPM incident in two-factor authentication, we went in 4 or 5 months from a 40% number to an 80% number, and as I like to say, it's not because we bought new technology during that 4-month period, right? You guys know we don't do that fast in the government. So it was management attention. And as we continue to educate management and leadership and get both the bottom up and really the top down pressure, after OPM, we had a lot of very interested secretaries and deputy secretaries. We have a new group of them now, and so we're working to educate them. We've got an interested set of leadership in the White House, so that is very helpful to be sure that this continues to be on folks' radar.
All right, to throw this curveball at you. When you talk about educating the secretaries and deputy secretaries, are you doing that through is cyber a topic at the President's Management Council every single time? Or are there cabinet, we know there's cabinet meetings, is it cyber come up every single time? Like, it's one thing to be like, hey guys, don't forget cyber, and it's another thing to have, for instance, the acting DDM or the OMB director show up and be like, hey, what's going on?
Right, so I don't think anything comes up every single time at either sets of those meetings. However, cyber certainly does come up in both those. We are working to be sure that it's appropriately inside of the President's management agenda, which will be driven through the PMC, the President's Management Council, to be sure that those deputy secretaries at that forum are aware and understand, and part of the EO mandated or reaffirmed the President's intent to hold secretaries accountable for their cybersecurity, and actually started with having them all do a risk assessment that came into us from the secretary level, not from the CIO or CISO, although they certainly did a lot of the work. So yes, we were working to push it in all those functions.
All right. Michael, you get 30 seconds, is already over. The audience here is both government and industry. I'm gonna throw the industry question to you. Where does industry's role in this workforce piece? It's training, we know that. It's the next shiny object, we know that, but what else is there that industry can do to help with this workforce challenge?
So first of all, we actually need to automate more of the tasks, right? We got to get the people out so that we need fewer people to do the jobs. 2, we actually need to think about how we actually do the training, not just on a technical piece, but we need to make sure that we're building we need to make sure that we've got MBAs that are cyber smart, economists that are cyber smart, lawyers, God forbid, that are cyber smart. All of those kinds of things. And then second, we really actually have to think about how we share the talent around between the private sector and the government and allow for much better movement back and forth between the private sector and the government so that we can all be taking advantage of the talent that's there.
All right, well, very good. I know we're a little over, so thank you for your patience. Let's please thank Grant and Michael. Thank you for listening. I'll pass it back over.